Hello and welcome to My PGCE, a podcast documenting my journey as a trainee teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James B. Salutations. It's been a very long time since I last recorded an episode. I'm recording this one at the end of the half-term holiday, and I haven't recorded an episode since before Easter. So that must be nearly 2 months ago. Now, this was because over Easter I got poorly, as I usually do during the holidays, reasons for which I've discussed in a previous episode. But because I was poorly over Easter, I couldn't work on my master's assignment, so I applied for a deadline extension, which they granted, but that meant I had to devote Saturdays during the term to working on my assignment. So I do apologise. It was my own poor health that led to this delay in episode scheduling. But I'm back, and I'm glad to be back, and I hope to resume my usual schedule of 2 episodes a month if I can. Now, the first thing, so a whole half term has passed since we last spoke. That's a lot of material, so I've distilled it down to what I think are some of the essentials or most important or interesting aspects of the last half term. You may wonder how I keep track of everything. I write reflections every single day, and this is something I'd recommend all new teachers to do. So at the end of each day, I just take 5 minutes or so making some notes on how I thought each lesson went that day, and I also usually make a note of anything funny or interesting that may have happened outside lessons. I'm going to turn it into a sitcom script one day. Anyway, so I make my reflections at the end of each day, and then when I come to record an episode, I read back through my reflections and highlight things that I think could be discussed in the episode. Then those get written down onto a notepad, and I inevitably end up crossing out most of them, and I'm just left with what I think are the most interesting points. So I've done that, but for a whole half-term worth of reflections. So yes, this is very much distilled down to the key elements, I would say. The first thing I'd like to discuss is progress. Now, in the hustle and bustle of being a new teacher, I think it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that you are making progress. You're becoming a better teacher. And I think this is part of the value of trainee teachers. Now, I discussed in a previous episode the value of trainee teachers. My original position on this was that trainee teachers were a burden that experienced teachers had to put up with to ensure the continuation of the profession. But I then learned that in fact they bring a great deal of value to schools. They help free up the timetables of other teachers, give them a bit more breathing space. They keep the ideas and philosophies fresh and optimistic. They keep the place young. The first school that I trained in had very few trainee teachers. It was a very nice school, really. It was the sort of school that teachers go to and never leave. So much of the teaching staff was old. And perhaps it doesn't matter how nice a school you work in, and maybe this is true for all careers. If you stay in it for long enough, you end up becoming a bit jaded. And so that school, despite being a nice school, I felt that among the teaching staff there was kind of a considerable cynicism towards the profession. And a lot of them were just looking forward to retirement. They were tired, basically. Whereas in my current school, There are lots of trainees, lots of young teachers, and it's a much more dynamic place, and I'd say a more fun place to work. So yes, that's something else that trainee teachers do. And the third thing, something which I myself have experienced firsthand recently, is they offer a point of comparison. So as well as maths, I teach computer science, and a computer science trainee teacher has recently taken over a few of my lessons, and I supervise and observe and support. He's a wonderful teacher. I think all of the key elements of being a good teacher he has in spades. But, there's considerable room for improvement on the classroom management side of things, as you'd expect with a trainee teacher. But by watching him, it allows me to realise how far I've come. Because that was me a year ago, maybe less than a year ago. I don't think I was as good as he is when I was a trainee teacher. But I'd like to think that, at least in terms of my classroom management, I'm considerably better now with an extra year's worth of experience. So having that trainee, observing that trainee, allows me to realise how much progress I've made since being a trainee teacher myself. And I think that's crucial. You have to keep an eye on the progress you're making. And I also think it's important that when you feel that you've stopped making progress in a certain direction, look for a new direction. That doesn't mean changing careers, by no means. I mean, it might do, but not necessarily. It might just involve taking on additional responsibilities, looking for new challenges. And I think that the teaching profession is abundant with responsibilities and challenges. So yes, progress is crucial. You need to feel like you're making steps in the right direction, and trainee teachers can help us by way of comparison to keep an eye on our own progress. I also measure my progress in another way. When I was a trainee teacher last year, and towards the beginning of this year as an early career teacher, I would do all of my planning for the week on a Sunday. Well, I say all. I would plan the main bodies of my lessons. I would leave out starters and homeworks, but I'd plan all the main bodies of my lessons on a Sunday. And I think this was born mainly out of anxiety, that I'd find myself in a situation in the week where I had too much to do and too little time to do it in. And I wanted to avoid that situation at all costs. So I'd just do the bulk of my lesson planning on a Sunday, and sometimes that would take me pretty much all day. But as the year has progressed, I've found myself being able to do more and more planning during the week, and earlier in the week. So in the final week before half term, I found myself planning for next week, the week after half term, by Tuesday, during my freeze. And by the time I came to the end of the week, I'd planned most of my lessons. So I'm no longer in a position where I'm having to do lots and lots of work on a Sunday, because I've managed to do most of it in my freeze during the week. And that, I think, is another measure of progress, at least in terms of efficiency. I'm becoming better at using my time, and I'm becoming a quicker lesson planner. And I'm starting to get to the stage now where I can recycle and reuse lessons that I planned last year, or maybe more recently than that. I'm happy enough with the way I plan those lessons to just tweak and reuse them. Whereas earlier in the year, the lessons I'd planned towards the start of my training year were useless. So I just started again from scratch. But now I'm in a position where I can start just tweaking and reusing things, which again is another great way, I think, to measure my own progress. But with this particular measure, it's important not to get carried away, and I'll explain what I mean by this. My Year 7s, on the Thursday before half term, had an assessment. And I thought, great, they can do their assessment, and I'll crack on with a bit more lesson planning. I have a real strong sense of completionism. So if I start planning, I don't know, my year 8 lessons for the following week, I really want to get it done. And I can't remember whether it was the year 8 lessons or not, but there was something that during that hour when my year 7s would be doing their assessment that I wanted to get done in that hour. I was focused on doing that. And sure enough, during the assessment, I was up and down fairly regularly because students had questions. They'd put their hand up and I'd go and see what was up, and then I'd return to my planning. But other than that, I was fairly blinkered. So unless a hand explicitly went up, I was fairly blinkered and I was fairly focused on planning my lessons for the following week. And I overlooked something, and it made me feel rather guilty. There's a boy in my class, an autistic boy, who is very easily distracted, and he requires considerable prompting to stay on task. And on this occasion, because I was distracted by my lesson planning, I failed to provide those prompts. And as I was collecting the assessments in at the end, it became clear that he hadn't done more than the first 2 questions, and this was because he'd got distracted by the pencil sharpenings on his desk. And my immediate reaction was kind of, one of annoyance. I said, "Why haven't you done more questions than this? Come on." And his reaction was, I don't know, I guess he felt a bit sad or upset that he hadn't done more. But on reflection, I really feel that was my fault. I know this student needs prompts, but because I was focused on getting my lesson planning done, I didn't provide those prompts and he failed to access the assessment. And he's a good mathematician. When he works, he can do really well, but it's so hard to keep him on task. I should have sat him next to me. I could have then done my lesson planning and very easily kept him on task as well, and I will do that next time. But the moral of the story is, I think here I was measuring my progress as a teacher on how much lesson planning I could get done in the week, whereas being a teacher isn't really about lesson planning, it's about teaching. It's about ensuring students can access the work, and it's about ensuring students feel valued. And on that occasion, I got that wrong. It's very easy, I think, to kind of go looking for these more quantifiable measures of progress. It's the reason I think people get addicted to the gym, because the gym gives you a very quantifiable way of measuring progress. Either you've ran a little bit further, or a little bit quicker, or you've lifted a little bit heavier, or you've lifted more reps, whatever it might be. And so I was falling into this habit of measuring my progress as a teacher by how many hours of lesson planning I could get done in the week and how much time I could thereby save myself at the weekend. But that is not the measure of a teacher. The measure of a teacher is how much a student has learned and how valued that student feels, which of course is harder to quantify, it's harder to measure. You may never really get a true sense of how well you've achieved either of those two things. It can be very difficult, but that's where my focus should be, and I'll make sure I get it right next time. Now, from one tricky Year 7 student on to another, I had an argument, a rather bizarre argument, with a girl in my Year 7 computer science class. It was right at the end, and I was pushing the limit of how close we were going to break time. There were a few things I still wanted to get done, probably sticking in or something. And this one girl just kind of very publicly said, "Well, I'm going to start packing away because it's nearly break time." I said in response, "You'll start packing away when I tell you to start packing away," and I probably snapped it at her. And she stood up and just started shouting at me and telling me off, and she called me an embarrassment. And I returned like for like. I mean, I didn't call her an embarrassment, but I argued with her. I had a very public argument with her, in the classroom, which was a very silly thing to do. And she didn't really back down, although I did just stop responding, and she sat down. And you should have seen the faces of the other students in the class. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. But in any case, I was unsure how to respond to this, and usually that would constitute rudeness to staff, which in my school is met with at least an hour's detention after school. But she came to me at the end of the lesson and apologised, and we had a very grown-up conversation about it. And she explained why she thought she flew off the handle, took full responsibility and apologised. And I apologised for my part in the argument as well, because it takes two to have a silly argument like that. And so I drew a line under it and left it there. But with hindsight, I don't know whether that was the right thing to do. I don't know whether she still should have had some other formal sanction, a detention. But by doing that, would that have made her less likely in the future to take responsibility for her behaviour and to apologise for it when she's got something wrong? I think it might have done. So I'm still unsure about that one. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. So suppose that in your lesson a student was very rude to you, and that would normally be met with some sort of formal sanction, a detention or something like that. But at the end they come and take full responsibility and apologise and speak to you in a very grown-up way. How would you respond? Would you draw a line under it like I did, or would you insist that this student should still have some sort of sanction? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, so from that tricky student on to yet another tricky student, this time in Year 10. Now, I teach a Year 10 beta class, so they are bottom set, at the very bottom. And there's only, I think, 12 of us, small class. And it's quite a delicate ecosystem in there. There are some characters in there. There are some students in there who have the potential to be quite disruptive. But we've found this kind of fragile equilibrium where we understand one another. We know what we're there to do. And on the whole, we do some good work. But it is delicate. It's fragile. And when I say that, I think I'm referring most specifically to the motivation in the room. So these students are the worst at maths in Year 10, yet they're going into their GCSE year and their target grades are very low. And so it's tricky to keep those students motivated and to get them to work. But we have managed to get it right, but it's delicate, it's fragile. Well, a new student has joined the class. She's joined the school, and she's come straight into my class, and she has bulldozed into the class, and her behaviour is very challenging, and she's paired up with another student who was widely regarded to be one of the trickiest in the year group, but who in my lessons would just kind of sit at the back and do her own thing and get some work done. But anyway, now she's paired up with this new student, and the two of them are very, very tricky, and it has really disrupted the equilibrium in that class. So there's been like a significant shift in the power balance of characters in that class now that this new girl has come in, and it's thrown up for me a considerable dilemma. So this new student has had a bit of a troubled upbringing, and she is relationships driven. So if I, as her teacher, fail to establish some sort of relationship with her, then I couldn't possibly hope to get any work out of her whatsoever, and I could expect her behaviour to get much worse and much more disruptive. Now, her behaviour at the moment is challenging. She often talks when I'm talking, and may talk to students across the room, and may sometimes get up and wander around the classroom. Now, if any of these behaviours had occurred with any of the other students, before this new girl had joined the class, that would have been met with sanctions. But with this new girl, I am hesitant to do so, because from what I've heard from other teachers who have tried to be very strict and crack down on her immediately, she just tells them to F off. And all of a sudden the relationship is ruined from the very outset. So I'm trying to go with a different approach, a more gentle approach, where I tried to just herd her towards doing the right thing rather than demand that she does the right thing, because I don't want to undermine that relationship. But this is difficult because all the other students in the class now think that for some reason I've lowered my standards. And so some of them have begun to play up. And then when I give them the appropriate sanction, they complain that I'm not being fair because the new girl isn't being sanctioned similarly. And this is very hard. And I'm not quite sure what to do, because I don't want to risk undermining my relationship with this new student. But similarly, I don't want to risk undermining my established relationships with all of the other students. Now, this issue hasn't come to a head yet, because I wouldn't say that this new girl's behaviour has disrupted other students' work yet. The work is still getting done, and the new girl, she also does do some work, but it's just intermittently. So the fact that the work is still getting done, I'm kind of content for the time being. I wouldn't say happy, but I'm content with the way things are. And hopefully this will allow me time to develop that relationship with the new girl, hopefully not at the cost of any of my old relationships, but develop the relationship with the new girl so that if I then do have to issue any sanctions, they will carry more weight and have more meaning, and she won't just tell me to F off. But I'm hoping that can happen quickly, before behaviour starts to become a problem with other students as well. So again, this is another issue that I would love to hear your opinion on. So when you have a class where there's a fragile equilibrium, but everything kind of seems to somehow work, and then a new student enters the environment and just overthrows the established order, what would you do? How would you try to accommodate that new student without disaffecting your old students? That's another tricky one. So yes, your thoughts would be appreciated. So that class is now, anyway, a challenge. But I also love that class. There's something about teaching students who are in a very bottom set which is so incredibly rewarding. When you do motivate them and when they do get it right, it means so much to them. So when I say that they get it right, I mean that, they are getting the correct answers on questions. Their faces really light up. It means a great deal to them, and that's contagious. It means such a great deal to me as well. And there's one student in particular in that class. I'm not sure whether teachers are allowed to have favourites, but she's my favourite student because she's been on such a journey. She joined the school last year. She came from Eritrea and she didn't speak a dot of English, and her mathematical ability was very poor. But she's been on such a journey since then. She's been so determined to improve her language skills and to succeed in all her subjects. And she's gone from being the bottom of the bottom set to now being near the top. And she works so hard, and she's such a kind girl. So on one occasion, I was having a little moan to my year 10s about my year 7s, about how tricky it was to get a whole class of year 7s to share 2 glue sticks, complete nightmare. And she came to me afterwards and gave me her own personal glue stick and said, "Here you go, sir, you can have this glue stick." She's such a kind girl. Although we had one issue, which was really surprising to me, because behaviour issues just don't happen with this girl. They just don't happen at all. She's an angel. But a few weeks ago, she kept drawing. Instead of doing her work in the lesson, she was colouring and drawing and highlighting and cutting and sticking. And I mean, that happens. It might happen once in a blue moon, and I just tell her to put it away and focus on her work, and she does so immediately. But on this occasion, I think I had to ask her 2 or 3 times. And I thought at one point I was going to have to give her a C1, which is just a warning, but that would have been unheard of for this student. So that was quite concerning. But in the end, she did put it away and return to her maths work. But then the next day, she came to me and she handed me this piece of artwork that she had made for me. And that's what she'd been doing in the previous day's lesson. She'd been making something for me. And it was like this star type picture that had been coloured in and decorated. And she said she wanted me to have it. And I noticed, funnily enough, that I recognised it from what she'd been doing the day before. Yet the bit she'd been doing the day before, she was doing a pink border with a pink highlighter. She'd cut that bit off. So I don't know whether that was her acknowledging the fact that she shouldn't have been doing it in the lesson. But in any case, I felt immediately guilty. I'd told this girl off, and she shouldn't have been doing it in lesson. But in any case, the fact that she'd been making something for me really touched me. And that's not the only thing that she's made me. She also wrote me a note. This was in the final week before half term, and I'm going to read to you this note. Now, bear in mind that English is her second language, but here we go. Mr. Brown, you are so very good because you are understand everyone. We are respect to you. You are so kind. You are not shout. I love maths. We have test today, and then I'm keep up. I love test. Because not hard, the test. That's why I love test. And then we are love you, keep happy, the end. Exclamation point. And she'd put a couple of stickers on this piece of paper as well. And that might be my favourite moment as a teacher so far. The fact that she thinks that I'm kind and that I don't shout, because I do shout sometimes. Not in that class, but sometimes I do shout as a teacher. It's something I'm trying to work on. Sometimes I shout just to be heard, but then it spills over into shouting at individuals. But anyway, so in that lesson I don't shout, and that's something she's noticed, and she thinks I'm kind and she respects me, and she loves maths, which is wonderful. So yeah, I think that might be, for me, the highlight so far of my teaching career, and I'll keep that note forever. So, last term, there was certainly some challenging behaviour, and there was some really nice moments as well, like that one. But on the whole, it was my most challenging term as a teacher to date. And this was because about halfway through the term, I developed a sleep problem. Now, at that point, I had several things on my mind. I think I was a little bit worried about my master's assignment that I was a bit behind on. I don't like having deadline extensions. I just prefer to meet the original deadline. So I think that was playing on my mind. I was also applying for a TLR, which I was offered, but then decided not to accept because I thought it was too much too soon, especially with the demands of my master's course. So that was playing on my mind too. I had some behavioural issues that I was worrying about, some of which I've discussed in this episode. I think I was also a bit worried about my partner, who was having to do some quite stressful assessments at university. So there were several things playing on my mind, and I woke up early one morning, about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and couldn't go back to sleep. because I had these things spinning through my head. And I didn't think much of it at the time. But then it happened again the next day. So I woke up again at about 3:30, 4 o'clock. Couldn't go back to sleep. So now I've had 2 days on the bounce where I've only had about 5 hours sleep or so. And then I started to worry about sleep. I thought, I can't go on like this. I feel awful. So much of my resilience seems to be based on whether I've had a good night's sleep or not. And I started to feel quite stressed at work, and everything was becoming more taxing. And I thought, I really need to start sleeping properly. So that added to the list of things I was worrying about. I was now worrying about sleep, to such an extent that I was now struggling to go to sleep at night, as well as waking up very early. So I think my worst night's sleep was, I normally fall asleep before 10, but I was struggling to go to sleep much before 1 o'clock and then waking up at 3:30 or 4. And that was about it. And this happened for about 2 weeks. Thankfully, it wasn't happening at the weekend, so I could catch up a little bit at the weekend, which did suggest that it was, the stress of school, which was exacerbating the issue. But I think it was mainly because I knew when I was going to sleep on a Friday or a Saturday night, I knew that the following day I could rest if I needed to. So the pressure was off. There was no pressure to get a good night's sleep because I wasn't in work the next day. And so sure enough, I got a good night's sleep. But during the week, I was really struggling. And I was over those 2 weeks, I probably averaged maybe 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. And it just turned me into a zombie. It was awful. And like I said, it really drove home the fact that sleep is just so important. I did manage to get it under control gradually. So several of those things that I had been worried about initially started to resolve themselves. So I had managed to do some work on my assignment, which took the pressure off. My partner's assessments at university had passed. I decided to decline the TLR. So all of these things I could kind of put behind me, so I had less to worry about in that regard. And I took a real good look at my sleep hygiene and tried to improve my pre-bedtime routine. So before, I would often go to bed and then read a book for a while before I'd go to sleep, but I'd be in bed doing that. Just a fiction book. I'm currently reading the Hyperion Cantos, and they're very exciting and very good. This may have also contributed to me not being able to sleep. I think I was so stimulated by the time I closed my eyes that sleep was always going to elude me. But anyway, I remember reading that you should only get into bed when you're ready to sleep. So that was one change I made. Instead of reading in bed before I went to sleep, I would read in a different room, in the living room usually, until I was literally nodding off before I would go and get into bed. That helped. I started taking magnesium supplements, which I read could also help with sleep. I also used CBD oil to help me relax. And if I was still struggling to sleep, I wouldn't just lie there and panic. I'd get up and I'd do something else. I might read my reading book for a bit longer. Or, if things were really bad, I would do a meditation session. And I went back to the guided breathing techniques that I used to do a good while ago. In fact, they helped me get through my training year as a teacher. I would do them each morning. So it's the Wim Hof method, a guided breathing method. And I would get up and do that if I was struggling to go to sleep, or if I had been to sleep and woken up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock, I'd get up and I'd do another guided breathing session until I was again kind of just nodding, and I'd get back into bed. And so with considerable effort, I managed to get the sleeping problem under control. In fact, I wrote a note for myself, and I'm going to read it to you. Let me just go find it. So, one night in the depths of my despair at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, I wrote this note to myself. You've shown you can teach. That was the first test. But can you now do it with little sleep? That is the next test. Tests help us grow, and they don't last for long. Be grateful for them while they last. And that's how I try to reframe the situation to myself. So rather than losing hope, I tried to see it instead as just a new challenge. And I should be grateful for challenges, because it's only by facing challenges that we grow as people. And I think I rose to that challenge, which was good. I managed to continue teaching my students. I don't think I dropped the ball. I didn't take any time off, which was good. And I managed to address the sleep issue. So I do think I grew from that particular problem and from that challenging half term. So it was that sleep issue that made the half term tricky, but I survived it. I limped into the half term break, but I got there. And I'm looking forward to the final half term of this year, my first year as a qualified teacher. And I'll be sure to check in with you more regularly. There are no looming masters deadlines, so there should be no issues there. If you like the episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter @mypgcepod or email mypgcepod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/mypgcepod and helping fund both the podcast and my PGCE course. Thank you, and talk again soon.